heard some version of the phrase slower than molasses in January. All right, I'm going to tell you why that phrase shouldn't mean what you think it does. And to do that, we're going to talk about Boston and the molasses flood. So this is the city of Boston, for those of you who may be unfamiliar. This is the neighborhood in the North End where the molasses flood occurred. And 100 years ago, it looked quite different. It was a mixture of waterfront industry, tenement houses, and some shops. And nothing in this neighborhood was larger than the molasses tank, which you'll see in a second. There we go. So this molasses tank stood 50 feet tall. You can see it towers over the elevated railroad there, 90 feet across, and it was poorly built, so it leaked from the very first day it was filled in late December 1915. And you may wonder why there is a giant tank of molasses. It's because it can be fermented into our good friend ethanol, which was used to make munitions during World War I. And so that takes us up to the life of the tank through November 1918. After that, they decided as a stopgap measure they were going to make rum in order to try and beat Prohibition. And this was a great plan right up until the point that their poorly built tank ruptured, tore itself apart, and disgorged 3.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of molasses through a neighborhood on a Wednesday during the lunch hour. Now, the devastation this caused is comparable to what you would expect from a tsunami or a tornado or some other kind of natural disaster. The buildings were smashed, the elevated railroad was taken down, people and horses were struggling through this muck that just covered several city blocks with molasses. And one of the things that people came up with very early on was the idea that somehow there had been an explosion. In fact, the company tried to claim that there were anarchists who had stuck a bomb in the tank, and that was why it failed. That's not why it failed. And in fact, if we look at it kind of from a more scientific perspective, we can decide pretty quickly that this lovely small-scale representation done by students at Harvard is not an explosion. This is what's known as a gravity current in my field of fluid dynamics. It's what happens when you have a very dense fluid like molasses working its way into a less dense fluid like air. And it's the same thing that happens when you have the physics of avalanches and mudslides and lava flows, which you'll hopefully see in a second, and also cold drafts that come underneath your door in the wintertime because you're in Chicago in January. And this works a lot better if my slides advance. All right. Well, you guys just get some background on gravity currents, because we started understanding gravity currents from a scientific perspective starting in about 1940, which, to be noted, is about 21 years after this accident. And part of the reason that people estimated that there had been some kind of an explosion is that the molasses was estimated to have moved at 35 miles an hour, which sounds crazy for molasses. But it turns out that if you do the calculations for a gravity current of molasses, it would move 35 miles an hour. This is because molasses is really heavy. It's about 1.5 times denser than water. And this tank is really full. There's almost 15 meters of molasses. So this combination of height and weight means you have a lot of potential energy, which changes into kinetic energy whenever you release it out of the tank. And that's how you get 35 miles an hour out of it. And if you look at the descriptions that people, that eyewitnesses gave of this, once again, timing is apparently an issue here. The eyewitnesses describe this, that kind of first 30 seconds, as being like a tsunami. They talk about a tidal wave, they compare it to a wave on the beach, they talk about it looking frothy and like it's boiling oil, which is absolutely nothing like what we imagine molasses to look like. I mean, I've never seen molasses look like that, and none of you have either, or you might not be here right now. Molasses, on the other hand, we're used to looking like this. It's really slow, it's really goopy, the technical term is viscous, and one of the things that the research team I worked with did was we used this machine here to measure what that viscosity is and how it changes with temperature, because there were a lot of temperatures involved in this flood. And that turns out to be really important for what goes on after the flood occurs. Namely, once this flood spills out, all of that molasses is getting colder as the day gets colder, and it goes from being day to night, and that molasses is getting more and more viscous. We measured that over the temperature range relevant to the flood, the viscosity increases by a factor of 100. So that means that all these people that are trying to move this molasses-covered rubble are dealing with things that are getting harder and harder to move, and all of the people who are trapped underneath that rubble are losing energy, probably losing blood as well, and struggling to try and keep this molasses away from their mouth and nose long enough for somebody to lift the building that's on top of them off of them. So this is part of what causes this to be as deadly an accident as it was. 21 people were killed, 150 were injured, many severely, and the company that was responsible ultimately settled out of court for what would be almost $10 million in today's money. Now, most of what we know about this accident comes from the trial transcripts, a picture of which you can see here. There are about 40 of these volumes, totaling, I think, 20,000 pages, which I've been slowly working my way through, trying to find needles in this haystack that will tell us more, that we can do scientific study of what actually went on before and after this accident. So you can see here some of the small-scale experiments and the modeling that my colleagues and I have been doing. And we still have a lot of interesting open questions to try and answer, but what I'd like to leave you with is that physics tells us that even innocuous fluids like molasses, under the right circumstances, can be deadly.